Hello and welcome to Philosophy Over Tea, the place to begin your journey into philosophy if, like many others, you have no idea where to begin. Philosophy Over Tea takes you through the major philosophical concepts, exploring different philosophers, and even future technologies along the way in a casual, easy-to-understand manner. This episode, we explore what philosophy actually is, and why you should bother learning about it. So what is philosophy? That in itself seems like such a philosophical question. Let's break the word down to its roots. The first part of the word philo means love in Greek, and the second part means wisdom. Putting them together, philosophy is quite literally the love of wisdom. It is this love of wisdom and learning and knowledge that convinces many philosophers to seek the things they do, to ask the questions they do. And it is hopefully that same love of wisdom that has brought you today to this podcast. At its surface, philosophy appears to be a social science. However, as you look deeper into it and learn and explore it more, it is a lot more than that. Philosophy can be seen to touch on almost every single aspect of your life. Philosophy's questions range from the physicality of things around you, all the way to the development of future technologies. It has very, very real and physical applications in our lives. Philosophy is very often consulted when answering ethical questions raised in areas such as government policies, or even in the logic required in computer programming. Almost everything has some sort of roots in philosophy. Through philosophy, we are able to explore concepts such as the meaning of life, the existence of God, consciousness, free will, politics, religion, economics, art, linguistics, and so many others. Philosophy has almost no bounds at all. Broadly speaking, philosophy is divided into 6 major themes, and they originate from these basic questions. What do I know? How do I know it? Where do we come from? What is good? What is beautiful? And how do we act? The first of these questions, what do I know, is answered by the field known as epistemology. Epistemology is concerned with the nature and scope of knowledge, including its limitations, and it addresses 4 main questions. What is knowledge? How is knowledge acquired? What do people know? And how do we know what we know? In different parts of epistemology's extensive history, its varying facets have attracted attention from notable philosophers. Plato's epistemology was an attempt to understand what it means to know, and how knowledge, as opposed to mere opinion, is good for the knower. Locke's epistemology was to understand the operations of human understanding, while Kant's epistemology was an attempt to understand the conditions in which it is possible for humans to understand the world around us. Russell's epistemology, which is more recent, was an attempt to understand how modern science could be justified by appeal to sensory experience. In much recent work, formal epistemology has made an attempt to understand how a person's confidence is impacted by their rationality. Feminist epistemology, in a similar vein, has been studying how our collective interests and biases can affect the evidence we collect, which in turn can have major impacts on our knowledge. In each of these cases, epistemology aims to understand some form of cognitive success, which refers to how rational one's mind is. Among the many types of cognitive success is knowledge. And epistemology divides knowledge into 3 primary areas. The first of these is about knowing facts. When a knower knows a fact, there are certain conditions that must occur, and these are explored under this area. The second area of knowledge is about knowing individuals. This area claims that knowing many facts about a person does not necessarily mean you know them. Take the example of Napoleon. Many of us have learned plenty of facts about him in school, but do we really know him as a person? Those are the sorts of questions that this area explores. The third area of knowledge is about knowing how. Under this area, we realize that knowing many facts about an action does not necessarily mean that we know how to perform that action. A common example of this is swimming. You might know lots of facts about swimming, but until you get in the pool or try the actions yourself, you can't claim to know how to swim. On the other hand, it is not necessary to know any facts at all about swimming for one to be able to swim. Following on from epistemology, which answered what do we know, we now ask the question about how do I know it. To answer this question comes in logic, which is the study of reasoning and how to create arguments. This area of philosophy is further divided into two primary sections, known as deductive and inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning refers to drawing logical conclusions from examples and axioms, whereas inductive reasoning refers to drawing general conclusions from very, very specific examples. A better way of understanding it is this. Deductive reasoning is what is used majority of the time in the scientific method. You start with a theory, which is extremely general. After that, you develop a hypothesis, from which you then test things and gain observations, and these observations then either confirm or deny your initial hypothesis. An example of this could be the following. Let's say we know that all humans are mortal. We also know that John is a human. Using this information, we can reasonably deduce that John is mortal. Conclusions that come from deductive reasoning will always be correct, provided that the thought process is logical and that the original information is true. However, if the initial generalization or theory is incorrect, the conclusions can be false, even though they are logical. Inductive reasoning, on the other hand, can be thought of what is used by detectives, such as Sherlock Holmes. It starts from something very specific, such as an observation. After the observation, you start developing a pattern. Using that pattern, you develop a specific hypothesis, after which you develop a very general conclusion that can apply to many things. In this form, we always start off specific, unlike deductive reasoning, which started off very general. An example would be the following. Let's say I pull out a coin from a bag, and it's a penny. I reach in again, and pull out another coin, and once again, it is a penny. The third coin I pull out also happens to be a penny. Based on inductive reasoning, I conclude that every coin in this bag is a penny. However, even if all the premises are true in this situation, the conclusion can still be false. A better example of a false conclusion can be a situation such as this. Let's say that Harold is your grandfather, and Harold is also bald. Based on these bits of information, I conclude that all grandfathers are bald. But despite these issues, inductive reasoning still has its place in the scientific method. It is used in the process to come up with hypotheses and predictions. Besides these, there is also a third, less used and less viable form of reasoning known as abductive reasoning. Unlike inductive and deductive reasoning, this is used very minimally in the scientific method. Abductive reasoning usually starts with an incomplete set of observations before coming to the most likely conclusion there is. It is based on making and testing hypotheses using the best information available, and often entails making an educated guess after observing a phenomenon for which there is no clear explanation. For example, a person walks into their living room and finds torn up papers all over the floor. They know that their dog has been alone in the room all day, so they conclude that the dog tore up the papers because it is the most likely scenario. Another scenario in which his papers could have ended up torn up could have been if his sister had brought his nieces home and it had been the niece that tore up the papers. Or another situation could have been that the landlord came in and decided to rip up the papers. However, the dog theory is still the most likely, so that is why the person decides to go with that. While abductive reasoning is not necessarily used in the scientific method, it can still be useful in some cases for coming up with predictions and hypotheses. It is used often by doctors who make a diagnosis based on test results, or by jurors who make decisions based on the evidence presented to them. Logic can get a lot more complicated than just these explanations, which is why there have been centuries of debate on it. However, this is just a brief introduction, and we will get into more detail about it in future episodes. The fourth branch of philosophy, which answers the question what is good, is known as ethics. This field of philosophy addresses questions about morality, including concepts such as good or bad, right and wrong, justice, virtue, etc. According to Aristotle, we study ethics in order to improve our lives as humans. Therefore, its principal concern is the nature of human well-being. Many philosophers, such as Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates, place virtues and ethics at the center of having a good life, which is why those and a considerable number of other philosophers have contributed so much to this field. Aristotle and Plato agree that ethical values, such as justice and honesty, are complex social skills that we must all develop. However, Aristotle disagrees with Plato's idea that we need to have a good understanding about what goodness really means before we can develop these virtues. He argues that what we need in order to live well is a proper appreciation of how goods such as friendship, family, wealth, virtue, pleasure, and honor all fit together as a whole. Theories that come under the branch of ethics are divided into two distinct sections: normative ethics, which is the effort to justify moral codes, and non-normative ethics, which investigates the logic and language of these moral systems and explores whether they can be objective or not. When it comes to normative ethics, all moral codes fall into one of these subdivisions. They are either A. consequentialist theories, which hold the position that an action is determined to be right or wrong based on its consequences, B. deontological theories, which claim that the rightness of an action is determined by some feature of the action or the entity responsible, or C. virtue ethics, which maintain that the rightness of an action is determined by the character or intention of the person carrying it out. Falling under each of these divisions are specific moral theories, such as utilitarianism, egoism, hedonism, divine command theory, existentialism, and so many others that we will explore in future episodes. Non-normative ethics, on the other hand, is the field of ethics that examines metaethics and descriptivism. Metaethics is the philosophical investigation of the language and logical relations within ethical systems. Those that debate the language of philosophy argue a few key perspectives. One argument is that moral language has a great deal of meaning, although there is plenty of disagreement as to what the meaning actually could be. The other side argues that language is completely and utterly meaningless and portrays nothing at all, a stance that might break a linguist's heart. They claim that language is entirely performative and only exists to get a reaction out of others rather than to convey a message. The other side of metaphysics is known as descriptivism, which examines morals from an ontological perspective. They question whether moral principles are objective features of the world, or whether they are simply relative concepts that do not truly exist outside of individuals or cultures. Objectivism, a subdivision of descriptivism, claims that morals are a part of the discoverable world, while relativism maintains that morals are not part of the objective world and are relative either to the person carrying them out or to another group or community. The next section of philosophy that we will be exploring is known as metaphysics. The word metaphysics has been notoriously difficult to define in the past. It originally came from one of Aristotle's collections containing 14 books. However, Aristotle himself did not know the word, nor did he coin it. About 100 years after his death, an editor published all of these works under the name Ta Meta Ta Physica, which loosely translates to after the physical. This was a warning to other philosophers to first study the physical world before studying the metaphysical world. The next major shift in the definition of metaphysics occurred during the medieval period. Prior to medieval times, a great deal of philosophers considered those who denied the existence of a god, for example, to be anti-metaphysicians. However, post-medieval philosophers would agree that both the denial and acceptance of a god is part of metaphysics. This contemporary conception of metaphysics is nicely illustrated by a statement of Sartre's. I do not think myself any less a metaphysician in denying the existence of God than Leibniz was in affirming it. Following on from that, until the 17th century, metaphysics was defined as the study of things that do not change, or are the first causes for things. However, as more and more studies, such as free will and personal identity, began to be included under this umbrella, this definition had to be expanded, as the original did no longer stand. Metaphysics now explains the fundamental nature of being and the world, and it is divided into three primary categories. The first of these categories is known as ontology, or general metaphysics. It is the investigation into what types of things there are in the world and how these things are related to one another. In more general terms, it explores what entities exist and how they can be grouped based on their characteristics or attributes. It also defines hierarchies in the world and different relationship between different entities, such as what subgroups they might be in based on their attributes. There are a number of important philosophical problems at the intersection of logic, which we discussed earlier, and ontology, and we'll be exploring the relationship between the two in later episodes. When questioning what is there, as is done in ontology, there occurs another problem, which is about how to settle these questions and answer them properly. Ontology concerns itself greatly with questions about things such as the existence of God, or whether numbers and math are integral to the universe. As there is no proper way, so far at least, to test for these things, it has developed into a major ontological issue. Based on these definitions and issues, ontology can be said to investigate, first, what is there in the world, second, what characteristics these things have, and third, how to prove that something exists within the world. The second of these fields is known as religious metaphysics. This field is primarily concerned with three questions. The first, which is somewhat related to ontology, explores the question of God, not only exploring whether God exists or not, but also what God's responsibilities might be. Is it possible that there is more than one God, or is monotheism real? The second deals with ideas of freedom, including things such as the freedom of will, among others. The third segment explores the idea of immortality and what can be considered immortal. It includes one of the popular ideas that a man dies twice, first when his soul leaves his body, and second when he is forgotten. And if someone only fully dies after being forgotten, is it possible to be considered immortal if you leave a legacy strong enough? The third subdivision within metaphysics is known as physical metaphysics, more commonly known as cosmology. This discusses the real nature of the universe, including things such as time, space, the laws of nature, matter, etc. Metaphysics is considered by many to be the precursor to modern-day science. Before the development of modern science, scientific questions were addressed as a part of metaphysics known as natural philosophy. However, after the scientific method was developed and universally accepted, natural philosophy became a physical and experimental activity, unlike the rest of philosophy. By the end of the 18th century, it had to be called science in order to distinguish it from philosophy. The next concept we're going to take a look at is known as political philosophy, which derives its roots from ethical philosophy. Political philosophy studies concepts such as liberty, justice, property, rights, law, and the enforcement of a legal code by authority. It examines questions such as what these concepts actually are, why or even if they are needed, what makes a government legitimate, what rights and freedoms a government should protect, what form the government should take and why, what duty citizens have to a legitimate government, and when a government should be overthrown. Although political philosophy and political science are intimately linked through various issues, methods, and concepts, there is a clear distinction between the two. Political science predominantly deals with existing states of affairs, and it aims to be amoral in its descriptions and seeks a positive analysis of social affairs. For example, constitutional issues, voting behavior, the balance of power, and so forth. Political philosophy, on the other hand, generates vision of the good or ideal social life, of what ought to be the ruling set of values and institutions that hold society together. Political philosophy finds its roots in ethics by asking the question, what kind of life is the good life for human beings? Since people are social by nature, it follows that the question develops into asking what kind of life is good for people among other people. Philosophical debates and discussions concerning politics then develop, broaden, and flow from these ethical roots. Let's take a more specific example of how ethical philosophy can affect politics. A utilitarian in ethics is one who claims that the good is characterized by seeking the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. Accordingly, in the political realm, the utilitarian will support the establishment of institutions whose purpose is to secure the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. In contrast, an ethical deontologist, who claims that the highest good is served by our application of duties, will support those institutions that best serve the employment of said duties. As ethics can be traced back to metaphysical and epistemological theories, political philosophies can also be traced to those. Theorizing on the nature of reality and how we know things, which is what metaphysical and epistemological theories do, relates to how we do things and how we interact with others. One of the primary ethical political concerns examines the idea of the ethical self. Philosophers divide the self between those who consider a person the sacrosanct, which is someone who acts alone, and those who consider an individual as a member of a group, and thus represents the entire group's values rather than just their own. In pursuing a philosophical understanding of political activity, philosophers also divide between those who are individualists and those who are holists. Individualists seek to explain social actions and behavior in terms of individual actions, whereas holists seek to explain behavior by considering the nature of the entire group. Individualists argue that a group is nothing more than each individual put together, but holists would argue that groups are more than just the sum of their parts. In the political realm, this translates to the state being bigger and better than just the citizens on their own. The sixth and final branch of philosophy discusses the concepts of aesthetics. This is the branch of philosophy that deals with the nature of beauty, art, taste, and the appreciation of beauty. It is more scientifically defined as the study of sensory or non-sensory emotional values, sometimes called judgment of sentiment and taste. Aesthetics asks questions about what is beauty. Is beauty in the eye of the beholder, or can beauty be considered something that is completely and truly objective? The philosophy of aesthetics is divided into two major sections: the philosophy of art, which refers to critics and appreciation of a work of art, and the philosophy of beauty, which applies to positive responses towards objects in the world. Aestheticians ask questions like, what is a work of art? What makes a work of art successful? Why do we find certain things beautiful? How can things of very different categories be considered equally beautiful? And many, many others. We will be exploring many of these questions in depth in future episodes. Well, that brings us to the end of the episode. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. In future episodes, we will be looking at the 6 different sections of philosophy, as well as examining other notable philosophers and future technologies as well. Please leave any comments or feedback in the email mentioned in the description, and have a wonderful day. you.